Interlude. How it's better than dragon slaying, probably. Well now, that is quite the plan. Oh, you're too kind. They were at the house of a noble, which stood beside the river that flowed through the capital. It was so late at night that even the moons had hidden their faces. Two men sat drinking at a table in a parlor whose luxury befitted a high official. One of the men wore clothes cut to accommodate his portly frame. He was part of the nobility of this nation. Across from him sat a man bearing a strange holy mark in the shape of a single forbidding eye. He was one of those who followed an evil cult. In short, this was one of those events that had been held time and again since the very founding of the world, a banquet between companions in evil, controlling the goblins using the fiery stone from heaven, causing them to kidnap the princess and sacrifice her to resurrect the greater demon. If we could crossbreed the greater demon with the thing from beyond the stars, we could create a true horror, the cultist concurred. It could impersonate the princess, but it would be under our control, so we could manage the king somehow. The nobleman gave a belly-shaking laugh. He didn't seem to have any doubts about his ability to control an unknown entity from another realm. If even one of those plots succeeds, well and good. But even if they all fail, if we spread a rumor that the princess was violated, then no one would want to marry her. The power of the bloodline would wane, the king's royal glory would be overshadowed, and the scales of the court would tilt dramatically. Why should that whelp of an adventurer run the government just because he's got a few drops of royal blood in him? The nobleman said, shaking his head in intense displeasure. It was a gesture overflowing with pity for the world, with righteous indignation, completely characteristic of the great many high-class people in town. It said more about who he thought was fit to control the government than 1,000 speeches ever could. As for myself, I'm perfectly content to let His Majesty sit on the throne, so long as my faith continues to spread, the noble follower of the God of wisdom said pleasantly. The knowledge of him is good for my profits, after all. But what's to be done about the hero? Easy enough. She's a sweet little girl whom we can wrap around our little finger with a bit of forning, oh platinum, we'll say. Oh great hero. The first nobleman allowed the cultist to pour him more wine. He wiped away a few red droplets with his sleeve. If she plays along with us after that, then fine, the cultist continued. If not, we find some convenient excuse to send her on a suicide mission. I can't see myself getting along very well with her type. Nor she with you, I suspect. How I would like to see her and her friends begging pitifully for their lives. The nobleman smirked at the nasty image in his mind. The cultist, picking up on his amusement, chuckled and sipped his own drink. It made scant difference to him what happened to some so-called hero, or sage, or sword saint, women all. But if his porn were to gain their powers, what a thing that would be. Yes, that was all he cared about. Knowledge was power, and power ruled the world. Few could truly understand what a sweet and beautiful thing that was. That thought might have prompted, in some sense, a small factoid that flashed through the cultist's mind and then disappeared. I was thinking, it's been some time since I heard any rumors of that interloper. Hehe, what? Do you believe what people say? Don't make me laugh. That's just the idle fancies of peasants. That was when it happened. The quake, the wind, the thunder. For a moment, they thought perhaps it was the sound of the river grown especially violent, but then came the roar. It was, quite literally, the sound of a battering ram at the castle gates, the prow of a ship striking a wall. Bursting through the wall of the parlor came, indeed, the prow of a ferry boat. What is the meaning of this? The nobleman and the cultist shouted. An answer came, likewise, from the ferry boat. It's been a long time, you scum. The sculler existed more as a small, dim silhouette than anything, judging by the lines in the figure's black clothing. Might it be a young woman? But this spy was not the source of the words. Instead, the speaker was a man, standing beside the sculler with a dignity that seemed out of place. He looked down at the astonished villains and growled derisively, "It's been a long time, you scum. Have you missed me? Look, yes, look at his glittering accoutrements. Shining brightly even there in the dark were his armor, his shield, his helmet, and his gloves, as well as the sword that hung at his hip. He carried enough magical items to astound any onlooker: a blessing of healing, an evil-banishing light, an anti-freezing charm, a primal flame, and a whirling wind. And his name was the Knight of Diamonds. He was supposed to be nothing more than a myth, a fairy tale passed around among the common people. A phantom about whom whispers had spread in the city these past few years. A man who hid his face and punished evil by darkness, a true knight of the streets. But he couldn't be real, there was no one that crazy. For starters, slaughtering crooked merchants and nobles and cultists of one's own accord, didn't that make him a simple murderer? How could that boy playing at being king, with all his talk of righteousness, allow such acts to go unchecked? Yet, there he was, right in front of them. But who exactly was he? Or what? He must be a simple deviant, thus the nobleman seemed to think. He had either remembered his own station and honor or had concluded that his visitor was a simple ne'er-do-well. Feeling he had a better grasp now on his own position, he said forcefully, "Impudent fool. Whose residence do you think you're in? Remove your helmet, at once." "Oh ho. So you want to see my face, eh?" The Knight of Diamonds sounded almost amused. He laughed with a sound like a lion baring its fangs. "I'm happy to oblige, but I don't think you're going to like it." With that, those glittering gauntlets reached up to his visor, lifting it without a sound. Then his face stood revealed. The nobleman and the cultist alike felt their eyes go wide. What? It can't be. That was all they could say. They were witnessing something that could not be. Something unbelievable, something that shouldn't exist, but the knight's was a face they knew all too well. Their knees went weak, and they gasped for breath, forgetting themselves as they babbled, "Come. Come forth." The shouting brought armed men of the noble's personal guard running. The cultist, meanwhile, warped space as he summoned fiends and ghouls from another realm. The fact that the guards didn't flinch at this was proof enough that they were co-conspirators of the men. Gods. The Knight of Diamonds groaned. Yes, one had to be broad-minded enough to accept all kinds of people, but that was no reason to turn a blind eye to evil. And there was no arguing with men like this, they would simply try to twist everything to their benefit. On top of that, considering how personal the stakes were in this instance, everything seemed tailor-made to put the knight in a bad mood. The young woman in the shadows, seeming to sense the knight's thoughts, let out a breath of simultaneous exasperation and resignation. The Knight of Diamonds ignored her completely, laughing out loud. "It looks like you're far beyond talk. Your fate is sealed." Still looking at the pitiful noble in front of him, the knight lowered his visor once more and drew his sword. The blade was all blinding flash, the stroke so violent and so precise that even the wind from the passing sword could have beheaded a man. As if to emphasize to the men that they couldn't flee from before his blade, the Knight of Diamonds declared, "On behalf of heaven, I claim your lives." Here, now, there was no place for mercy anymore. Chapter 10. My prayers, have you reached heaven? So after all that, he didn't accept a reward. No? High Elf Archer pounded the table, making the dishes jump. Can you believe it? She had been grievously wounded not long before, but after a few days' rest, she was already back on her feet. That was an elf for you. Guild Girl glanced, a little discomfited, at the others at the table but, nonetheless, still smiled. Witch enjoyed a sip of her wine with an innocent expression, and as for Priestess, she looked much the same. For those gathered around the table, each with their own thoughts, High Elf Archer's fit of temper was nothing new. Everything had been more or less as normal in the frontier town while Goblin Slayer and his party were away. Adventurers drank, laughed, went on adventures, fought, and came home, or, occasionally, didn't. It was just daily life, Priestess thought, that they had come back to. I have to point out, Guild Girl said, he did take a reward. Yeah, for goblin slaying. High Elf Archer's ears bounded up and down in absolute frustration. She looked thoroughly drunk, except that the stuff in her cup was grape juice. Evidently, she was in an exceptionally bad mood today. Well, that's just who he is, Guild Girl said quietly. She leaned on the table with a "What can you do?" Even if the person he rescues is a young noble woman, he simply sees goblin slaying as goblin slaying. And for him, maybe it is. Maybe, priestess concurred. She said nothing else, partly because there was nothing in the statement to disagree with, partly because it was true, and partly because she felt the same way. I heard there was a real ruckus in the capital, too, Guild Girl went on. Another of the evil cultists' bases was destroyed or something. But I wonder who this Knight of Diamonds you hear about sometimes really is. Guild Girl cocked her head. Priestess didn't know the answer. It was true, for the person she was thinking of, goblin slaying was just what he always did. But even so, she could tell that maybe there were more worldly ways to go about it. He had saved a daughter of the royal household, even if it was just from goblins. He might not have been able to demand anything he wished, but surely, he would have been permitted a significant request. Like in a fairy tale, he could have married the princess and lived happily ever. Hey. Well, maybe not. But he might well have asked the king to take sterner measures against goblins, or requested a promotion to gold rank, or asked for some discreet royal support, or maybe he should be dreaming a little bigger, or not. It was a flippant thought. Yes, priestess saw that. But he simply said, "This is goblin slaying." No more and no less, and that was enough. Goblin slayer. That was what he wanted, and that was what he kept doing. Well, now. What's this, sighing? Which, ever perceptive, immediately picked up on the little exhalation. Today, you said something very cute about not wanting to go home. Did something happen to upset you? Witch's eyes ran over priestess, full of concern, and the younger girl looked at the floor as if to escape. No, not really. Not really, but... Her voice pinched, and she shook her head ambiguously. But what can I do to be more like you? She couldn't possibly ask such a childish question. She wanted to be outstanding. Beautiful and strong, giving, always mellow, knowing anything and everything, elegant and refined. That was the kind of person she wanted to grow up to be. Like witch, like sword maiden. After everything was over, after sword maiden had come rushing to the city, he and she parted without so much as a word. Sword maiden had been busy dealing with the aftermath, and goblin slayer had withdrawn quickly. Was that really all right? But something must have passed between them, something they could communicate without speaking. Even if she didn't know what it might be. For priestess, though, the adventure that had begun with Sword Maiden's quest concluded without ever really feeling to her as if it had ended. What had she been able to do? Indeed, could she do anything? Priestess brushed a hand over her garments, feeling the mail beneath, covering her small chest. She wanted to be a source of strength. That was what she had prayed for, but there were no sudden, eye-opening changes. She was still a novice adventurer with just a year or so under her belt, still an inexperienced steel rank. Suddenly, she was moved to glance around. She saw rookie warrior and apprentice cleric quietly celebrating something. At a table across the way, heavy warrior's party was seated, female knight making some bold pronouncement. At every turn, the tavern was filled with adventurers who seemed to sparkle. And what about me? It's hard, isn't it? The words, coinciding with her thought, came spilling out suddenly and quietly. High Elf Archer said, drawing a circle in the air with her finger. What's hard? Tell your big sister elf. I mean, getting stronger. Priestess put a finger to her lips, thinking for a moment, and then said, or maybe just growing, I guess. I was just thinking, it's not so easy. It's just a little overwhelming. Well, sure, High Elf Archer said as if none of this were any surprise. Even a tree doesn't grow up overnight. If it did, man, that'd be a shock. Her words held the kind of knowledge and wisdom only an elf could have possessed, but they were expressed with a very elf-like attitude. The disparity caused Guild Girl to laugh, the tinkling in her voice like the ringing of a bell. Well, worrying about it won't get you anything, she said. Right? And no one will trust you if you just go off on your own, and then come back claiming you've done a bunch of training. Guild Girl must have seen others like Priestess before. Her knowing advice was so gentle and kind it made Priestess want to cry. Come to think of it, Guild Girl added, I've got good news. Good news for you, at least. She clapped her hands and winked. Maybe she had noticed how Priestess was feeling. Good news. The royal princess, I've heard, has converted to a devout belief in the Earth Mother. Not that she's joining a nunnery or anything. That's... Priestess, completely at a loss for what to say, looked at High Elf Archer. The elf was all shrugs. It seemed there weren't many people she could discuss this with. She found an image passing through her mind of the girls who had gone to the temple after their first adventure. Their bodies had been mostly unharmed. It was their hearts that were most concerning. Priestess knew all too well how easy it was to break a heart, to shatter a mind. It was no good. She had been no good. Again, it seems she had a chance encounter with the cleric of the Earth Mother. What? Thus, these words that followed caught Priestess completely by surprise. She looked vacantly at Guild Girl, who had the look of a child sharing a secret. Allegedly, she said, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I want to grow up to be like her. Now Priestess was well and truly speechless. Like her? Was she being too presumptuous to think that her was, well, her? What? Unexpectedly, she found her vision blurring. She blinked, rubbed her eyes. It didn't get any better. And her cheeks were so hot. With no idea what to do, Priestess sobbed a little and let her face become tear-streaked. She had to get herself back under control. She was supposed to act cool and collected. If that poor girl were to learn about this, it really might break her once and for all. This wasn't the end of anything, but for Priestess, it was everything. And yet, for some reason, the world stayed misty and the words remained stuck in her throat. Hey, that's great. That really is good news, High Elf Archer said softly, gently. Which patted Priestess on the back. Guild Girl stayed silent, whether because she understood or not. It was impossible to tell. Really and truly happy to the depths of her heart, Priestess fought to open her mouth to say something. At that moment, the tavern door swung open, and Padfoot waitress went rushing past Priestess. For adventurers, the night was still young. The twin moons shone chill in the night sky. His breath fogged, mingling with the moonlight. Goblin Slayer walked down a small road outside town with his usual nonchalant stride. Nothing had changed. He had accepted the quest, gone to the location, killed the goblins, rescued the captive, and come home. That was everything. That was his duty. Just like the way the dry grass crunched under his feet, he knew. Nothing had changed up to this moment, and nothing ever would. The road went ever on and on, endless. Words High Elf Archer had spoken to him once upon a time suddenly came back to him. Look only at what's in front of your eyes. His master had said something similar once. Though he had added, because you're too stupid for anything else. Just focus on what's in front of you, take care of it, then go on to the next thing. Keep looking forward, move your feet. Stand up and proceed. That way, everything in the world will be taken care of. If you don't do it, nothing will change. Goblin Slayer found himself thinking. I cannot walk the same path as those girls. Unlike Sword Maiden, standing upon those walls, unlike Noble Fencer, fighting ever on, unlike even Priestess, who always kept moving forward, Goblin Slayer did not believe in the gods. He had never properly prayed. He didn't see the point, but for exactly that reason, he was deeply impressed by those who could and did believe. He felt that way about Lizard Priest, too, and Dwarf Shaman. Even High Elf Archer and Guild Girl, he wasn't sure what Spearman believed. Heavy Warrior, though, he was confident. Each and everyone. Goblin Slayer stopped and looked up at the heavens. 2 moons hung amid an uncountable number of stars. He grunted softly, almost a groan. Then he shook his head. He hadn't known what was right, but he knew what he ought to do. There was only one thing. He picked up his foot, stretched it out, and took a step. Then he raised the other foot, stretched it out, and took another. Walk. Move forward. Don't think about whether you'll get there or not. To keep walking, that was everything to him. Oh, welcome home. He raised his helmeted head when the voice came. There was a warm light, not too far distant. It must have been seeping out a window. He spotted her right away, leaning out the window, her red hair blowing in the night breeze. It's dark already, she said with a smile and a wave. It's dangerous to just stand there staring into space. He caught the scent of boiling milk on the breeze. Yes, he said at length, squeezing out the words. I'm home. Even though she could hardly have heard him, the girl grinned, oh, and nodded. Dinner's ready, okay. Come on in. Understood. He thought. Nothing has changed. He went on adventures and killed goblins. That was who he was. That was what he had chosen. And if the result of that choice was that nothing changed, he spent no more time thinking about it but went into the house, closing the door slowly behind him. The sound of it shutting echoed warmly through the cold night air. Autumn was nearly past, and soon it would be winter.